Okay, so I'm going to welcome Eric and Wright to our video recording in our class.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to vicariously be here with you today.
So my first question, the book is called American Society: How It Really Works, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the rationale for the "how it really works" part. What was the driving factor to really approach the book in this way, or approach the topic of American society as this "how it really works" notion?
So, of course, saying how it really works implies that there are views out in the world that are mistaken about how it works. And so the book is kind of an intervention into the myths of American society. Right? So this is how it really works, even if you think it works in somewhat different ways. It's also, once you get into the book, you realize it's part of a broader agenda, which is about how it really works and how it should work, how we would like it to work. So we have fantasies about how the world should be. We have misunderstandings about how it is. The book is about how it actually is and how it could be better. So all that's kind of packed into that subtitle.
Yes. And so one of my struggles in using this book actually has been that sometimes, unfortunately, some of you only read part of the chapter and then will respond to things.
And you should read every single page. I sweated over every word in that book.
But I think that there are some times where students misconstrue the tone and read into some of these myths and still find support for some of the myths and the way that they continue to kind of pervade U.S. society. And so I'm curious as to, are there risks and benefits in presenting kind of all of these myths in a book of this nature where, it's targeting an undergraduate population? I'm just curious if you've had this dilemma in classes when you've taught it, and if, I'm struggling with that as a person who uses the book to kind of make sure that everybody gets the full message, which is why it's great to have you here to talk about it.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and this is brought up in communications theory and research. When you talk about political advertising, for example, there is this argument that it's a mistake to present in an argument, in a political ad, the views you oppose and then criticize them. Because some people, when you present the views you oppose, will think those are the views you hold and won't understand why you're criticizing them because you hold them, and therefore they'll get confused or they'll just ignore the criticisms. So this is a question of the nature of human communication and what our perceptual biases are.
Yeah.
I frankly don't know a way around that other than to be clear, to tell students, read it carefully, don't just gloss over it.
Yeah.
But I think it is a risk. Misperception is a risk. And of course, if you give a speech, then you can be quoted out of context. There are these circumstances in which...
You have been quoted out of context in my class, for example.
Yeah, so people, I will say, here is a view that is commonly held, and I'll state a view that I think is ridiculous. Here is a view that is commonly held. African Americans are lazy. This is a really absurd idea. The average African American works harder when they can get a job than the average white person because of the stresses and demands on their family lives. Okay, so I add all that stuff, and somebody will then just take the thing out of.
No, but it's great because I think I'm learning more and more as I use this book that I have to be very clear up front that this is, that's the approach that's being taken, and I think it's a very effective approach because it does do a lot to challenge people's assumptions and a lot of those myths that are so pervasive. So
also, let me add one other thing, and this is a kind of more general point about writing and communication. I'm very committed to a pretty old-fashioned idea that's sometimes called the Enlightenment idea, which is that the way forward in collective deliberation is through rational argument, not through manipulation. Even in circumstances where you could more easily achieve your goals through manipulation. I really believe in the democratic principle that we want to seek mutual understanding and reach decisions through problem solving where everybody gets on board because everybody understands what everybody else really means.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's hard, but it means you do have to give a fair representation of views you disagree with, not a caricature of those views.
Yeah.
And you have to give a representation of them. You can't just assert your own views.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the book tries to embody, that kind of principle.
Okay, that's really helpful. So I know that your talk last night and the work that you're doing now is on real utopias, and so I'm just curious, out of the many solutions and ideas that you talk about in the book, I know the unconditional basic income, social wage, a lot of those kind of are prevalent themes, and I know students really find those appealing. But are those solutions some of your favorites, or are there other things that didn't make it into the book? I guess I'm just asking,
Sure.
what are your favorite examples that are here, or you might be considering including in the next edition?
Okay, so there's different reasons why things are favorite examples. Some are because I think if they could be instituted, they would make the most profound changes. Mm-hmm. And others are because I just think they're such beautiful embodiments mm-hmm. of my values, mm-hmm. but which they may not be the most important in the sense of. So in terms of what I think is conceivably achievable in the course of the next decades, mm-hmm. perhaps not in the United States because we're not going to be at the forefront of progressive change, but perhaps elsewhere. Mm-hmm. The single thing which I think would probably be the most important would probably be basic income. Mm-hmm. Because an unconditional basic income also opens up space for other changes. Mm-hmm. If you can create an economic mechanism of distribution in which large numbers of people can make the choice to engage in non-market activity to meet human needs because their basic needs are being provided mm-hmm. through this collective mechanism, mm-hmm. then you suddenly open up a space for a very different kind of economic mix. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the context of the global environmental crisis mm-hmm. that we're in. Not merely because of the social justice issues around inequality, but also because of the global issues around climate change. Mm-hmm. Giving people the opportunity to make the choice to live a simpler life of consumption mm-hmm. and to live a life that's more engaged with activity to solve social problems and meet social needs, mm-hmm. to give people that option, which a basic income makes possible, mm-hmm. that seems to me opens up all these possibilities. Okay. So that's why I think basic income is probably the one thing which I think it would be the most likely game changer.
Yeah.
It's not my favorite example in the sense of the one that makes my heart beat fast.
So which examples are?
Well, I think, so for example, in Madison, Wisconsin, there's a coffee roaster called Just Coffee. I encourage you to look at their website.
Yes.
The Just Coffee website is a fantastically interesting website to, tool around on. Mm-hmm. Just Coffee is a worker-owned firm that roasts coffee, in which they import their coffee from farmer cooperatives, mm-hmm. particularly in Central and Latin America, but also some in Asia and some in Africa as well. Their idea is to foster a kind of international coffee trade system that's built around cooperation, rather than capitalist corporations exploiting growers in the poorer parts of the world. When you go to their website and you look at a particular kind of coffee, you can click on it and meet the actual farmers who made the coffee you are drinking. You can see all of the invoices. You see exactly how much you buy a pound of coffee. You see how much those farmers got for the coffee you're drinking, mm-hmm. and how much is given to each of the steps between the farmer in the field and the cup on the table. Mm-hmm. Here's a.
Yeah, I know. We have no idea where this came from.
And then they're also trying to foster actual collaborative relations directly between roasters in the north and farmers in the global south. Mm-hmm. So they have brought, for example, women from a Nicaraguan women's coffee growing cooperative called La Femme. Mm-hmm. They brought them to Madison, trained them in coffee roasting, and in coffee brewing and barista type stuff. So this farmer cooperative in Nicaragua has opened up a coffee shop on the road near their farm, and now they make more money selling actual coffee to passersby in Nicaragua than they do through their export. And it has tremendously increased their standard of living within this community.
Yeah.
And this is part of their idea of fostering global cooperation. Well, I think, to me, that's a wonderful real utopia example, because it means the people who are building this alternative are not only creating an alternative way of life for them to work, which they find more meaningful and enjoyable, less dominated by profit maximizing imperatives, but they also see their activities as building really an alternative world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Just Coffee. I don't. It might be mentioned in the book. I don't.
Nope.
I think in the revision. I think
Is
in
it gonna go in the
I think
revision?
in the revision I've added a paragraph about Just Coffee.
Yeah, it's great. And have you talked to? I know you're going to speak in Dan Jaffe's class later, but
Yeah.
he's done a lot of research on fair trade, and it was really interesting. I was using his book in my graduate course.
The coffee book.
Yep, it challenges a lot of these ideas about fair trade, and I asked my students to come in with the ideas about what's an alternative to these fair trade models, and they all came in with direct trade and a much more similar system to the Just
So
Coffee.
the direct, it turns out that because there are economies of scale, that means it's cheaper if you ship a lot of coffee rather than just a little from a place, and if you receive a lot of coffee at a time rather than just little bits. It turns out that it's better for the coffee cooperative in Madison to join together with, I think now 22 or 23 other coffee roasters in the upper Midwest, and for them to create an importing cooperative.
Okay.
And for the importing cooperative to directly get the coffee from the worker cooperatives, rather than for it literally to be bilateral between the grower and the roaster. Because you can understand the reasons for that. It's, it simplifies things at both ends. Otherwise, because after all, Just Coffee can't take the entire crop. So that would mean that La Femme would have to negotiate arrangements with half a dozen other roasters.
Yeah.
And that's really beyond their capacity.
Yeah.
So having this importing cooperative, the grower cooperative, and the roaster cooperative gives you these three key cooperatives in what's called the commodity chain. That's the expression sociologists use to describe how a product goes from it's earliest production point to the final consumption point.
Yeah. Excellent. I really like that example. So I guess a lot has changed since 2010 when the book first came out. So I'm curious, we talked about this a little bit, but what are some of the changes you foresee in this newest edition? What do you think are some of the key changes since 2010, politically, economically?
Sure. So the biggest change in the book is the addition of a new chapter. There's a chapter on finance. It's going to have a slightly different character than the other chapters in that block. So this is in the first part of the book, which begins with a couple of general theoretical chapters to give everyone a vocabulary about how to talk about things. And then we look at particular sectors: health, transportation, the environment. The finance chapter has a somewhat different character because the first part of the chapter is devoted to a kind of careful explanation of the core ideas you need to have in order to even know what finance is. Whereas everybody knows what healthcare is, and everybody knows what the environment is, and everybody knows what transportation is. So we didn't have to, explain what's an automobile and what's a bus. We could assume that everybody reading the book would know what that means. We can't really assume that everybody really knows what a bank is. A bank is actually a pretty strange institution. Or what credits are, and what money is even. Money, gosh, that's a really mysterious thing. So we had to create this introduction to the chapter, which I'm still trying to refine. I want to make that as compact as possible. I know students get impatient with that kind of didactic exposition, but it's really important because we can't talk about how the American finance system works and why it's gotten out of hand, and particularly why it's become a site for such concentrated inequality and concentrated power.
Mm-hmm.
I think the shift of the American economy from an economy that has at its core making things and providing services to meet people's needs to an economy that's driven by finance, that shift is at the center of what's driven up inequality
Mm-hmm.
and what's driven up concentrations of power. These things go together.
Yeah.
So it is crucially important. We have to do this didactic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Future readers of the book, I hope it's not too painful.
Yeah, and I think along with that, I supplement the book right now with some readings about Citizens United, and I'll be
Right.
supplementing some extra stuff thinking about this recent McCutcheon decision. But I'm just wondering what you think you might add about some of the campaign finance stuff, and
Right.
how you think that fits in with the chapter on finance and how all of these changes are happening.
So we have added some material in the electoral democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Also some more in-depth discussion of the gerrymandering problem, because that's gotten worse.
Yeah.
It's gotten worse partially for technological reasons. That is, it's much easier now to draw a boundary around an electoral district in which you look at a region and you go block by block and draw the boundaries. So there are some really strange boundaries in the last election, which have produced significant distortions even beyond the other distortions we have.
Mm-hmm.
So there are the distortions that come from the role of money in politics.
Mm-hmm.
But in spite of those distortions, in the last election, more people voted for Democratic members of the House of Representatives than Republican.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 2012 election, which resulted in this very conservative dominated Republican House of Representatives, nationally more people voted for Democrats. And the reason why you can have more people voting for Democrats and end up with a Republican Congress is, in part at least, because boundaries of districts were redrawn after the 2010 election in order to make it harder for Democratic candidates to be elected. And that was successful.
Yeah.
So we have a discussion of gerrymandering, of voter suppression, the voter
Okay.
ID laws and
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
And a little bit more about the finance stuff. I mean, doesn't take much writing. It's pretty straightforward. And then the proposal for a democracy card, as an alternative way of financing elections.
And I think that's in
That's
here.
already there.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Are there other things that you would want students who are learning about U.S. society, who are new sociologists, to know about your work or about sociology in general? What are some pieces of advice, things you think that they should know?
What do I think you should know? Well, there's lots you should know.
There's lots.
In the opening gambit of the book, at the beginning of the book, where we lay out this very simple version of what we think sociology is, where the heart of it is basically saying what sociology does is study the rules of the game, where that idea of rules is a pretty open-ended one. It includes all sorts of things that you might not think of rules, includes certain kinds of habits, certain kinds of conventions, what sociologists call norms. So it sounds pretty dry when you first say it. What sociologists do is study the rules of the game. The important thing really to think about, and I think to me really the foundational idea, is that rules can be changed. It's not just that individuals can change. So we all have this idea that individuals can change their lives. They can decide they've been on a path of self-destruction. They can get their act together. Some of you, I imagine, some of you watching this video, had a pretty rough teenage life and ended up not living the kind of life you wanted to. And then, for whatever reasons, you were able to get your act together. That's kind of our expression, get your act together. So that's kind of an interesting idea, your act together. That sounds like you're on a play.
Yeah.
You're doing a play. And in a play, you have scripts. Getting your act together sounds like you're changing roles. You're playing a different script.
Mhm.
At any rate, we know what it means for individuals to get their act together and to live a more constructive life that's more constructive both for themselves and for the people they care about. When we talk about the rules of the game, we're talking about let's let the society get its act together. Let's collectively get our act together. That we can all make a world in which we live better lives. It's not just that individuals can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So we all intuitively understand what it means for individuals to do it. And when an individual does get their act together, in a way what they're doing is changing the rules by which they will live their own lives, which means they are in an environment where they have some kind of control over the rules that govern their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of these rules are internal. That's why people can get their act together. Well, I think the same is true about society. And that's the core of this book's point.
Mm-hmm.
That you observe the world as it is, you diagnose what the harms are, the ways in which it's troubling, you get rid of the myths, because if you make mistakes about that, you can repair things that don't need fixing and destroy things that do.
Mm-hmm.
And then understand that fundamentally, we have the power, if we act together, to change things.
All right. I think that's a good and fantastic hopeful note to leave this on. So thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you,
the time.
and I hope you've enjoyed slogging through this book. One thing, it's not always the case. It's usually not the case that when students read a book, they get to hear from the voice of the person who wrote it. Just so you know, when I'm sitting by myself in my office, working at my keyboard, thinking about how to formulate something, I really do have you in mind. I mean, I am writing this for you. I'm writing this in order to help you clarify things. I'm not writing it in order to impose my views on you. I'm writing it in order to create a kind of dialogue between what is clearly a perspective. I mean, I have strong views about things. I want to make those as clear as possible. I want to make the views I am opposed to as clear as possible. I want to give you the tools then to critically form your own judgments so that you can change the world.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much.